Hello, this is Sakina Myers, a simple citizen who reads and discusses interesting articles every week. And today, I'll be reading and discussing the New York Times article entitled, Why Rules on Smoking Should Get Even Tougher, published January 7, 2018, written by Robert H. Frank. The damage to non-smokers goes far beyond the effects of secondhand smoke. In the 1950s, a pack of Camels could be had for as little as 25 cents in some parts of the country. But in New York City today, heavy taxes have pushed that price north of $13. Even adjusted for inflation, that's more than a five-fold increase. In the intervening years, we've also banned smoking in restaurants, bars, and public buildings. Some jurisdictions have prohibited smoking even in outdoor public spaces. We have spent billions of dollars on media campaigns to discourage smoking. Given the long-standing American hostility to social engineering, each of these steps faced heavy pushback. When called on to justify them, regulators have offered their traditional response. Restricting individual freedom is often the only way to prevent undue harm to innocent bystanders. The specific harm cited has almost always been well-documented health hazards caused by secondhand smoke. This rationale is similar to the one for requiring catalytic converters on cars. We need them to prevent pollution that would otherwise cause undue harm to others. But unless you work in a crowded bar with no ventilation, the health risks from secondhand smoke are small compared with those from being a smoker. For example, more than 85% of American deaths from lung cancer are attributable to smoking, with fewer than one-third of the remainder linked to passive smoke exposure. Regulators may insist that their aim is not to protect smokers from themselves, but our regulations do vastly more to protect smokers by inducing them to quit than to protect bystanders. In fact, smoking also harms bystanders in a more important way. Each person who becomes a smoker makes it more likely that others will become smokers as well. This additional effect outweighs the harm caused by secondhand smoke by enough to suggest that our efforts to discourage smoking, strict as they seem, may not be nearly strict enough. Some are more sensitive than others to environmental influences. I have 4 adult sons, none of whom is a smoker. I once remarked to a friend that if they had grown up when I did, at least 2 of them would be. My son Chris, who was present during this conversation, immediately asked, "Which 2? David, my oldest, almost certainly would have been, I said, and Hayden, my youngest, probably would have been too. I added that Jason wouldn't have smoked no matter when he had been born. Chris seemed offended, insisting that he too probably would have become a smoker if he had grown up when I did. When I started smoking at age 14 in 1959, many of my friends had already been smoking for several years. My parents didn't want me to smoke, but as smokers themselves, they were poorly positioned to object. In those days, more than 60% of American men were smokers and almost as many women. Smoking was just something that most people did. Yet, even then, people who smoked did not seem happy about it. Today, roughly 90% of smokers say they regret having started, and about 80% express a desire to quit. Some 40 to 50% of smokers try to quit each year, but fewer than 5% of them succeed. Several of my own attempts to quit failed, so I count myself fortunate to have abandoned the habit before leaving home for college. The reason I succeeded in raising non-smokers that my parents did not is that Today's environment is very different from the earlier one. By far, the most powerful predictor of whether a person will smoke is the percentage of her closest friends who smoke. If the share of smokers in someone's peer group rises to 30% from 20%, for example, the probability that she will smoke rises by about 25%. Whereas most of my teenage friends were smokers, relatively few of my son's friends were. In 2016, only about 19% of American men were smokers, and only about 14% of women. Today's environment is different mostly because of the taxes and other regulatory measures we have taken to discourage smoking. Well and good, but does anyone think that still having more than one smoker in 6 people is a desirable population ratio? Our stated rationale for discouraging smoking, to prevent harm caused by secondhand smoke, greatly understates the amount of harm that these actions prevent. When a regulation results in one smoker fewer, every friend of that person will have one smoker fewer in her peer group. Every member of every one of those peer groups will then become less likely to smoke, and that in turn will make others less likely to smoke, and so on. Most people don't like being regulated, but even strict libertarians concede the legitimacy of regulations to prevent undue harm to others. As John Stuart Mill memorably wrote in On Liberty, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not sufficient warrant. Causing someone to be more likely to smoke clearly inflicts substantial harm on that person. I have never heard even the staunchest libertarians say, "I hope my children grow up to be smokers." Further discouraging smoking now will make it much easier to raise children to be non-smokers. Evidence suggests that stricter measures to discourage smoking would make even smokers themselves happier. In a 2005 study, for example, the economists Jonathan Gruber and Sindel Bulanathan found that people with a higher propensity to smoke were significantly happier in places with higher cigarette taxes. Higher taxes, they noted, made it easier for smokers to quit. Today's regulations to discourage smoking are strict, yes, but without violating libertarian sensibilities, we could adopt even stricter measures. And that concludes this article. Now it's time for my discussion. And just recently, my mate died from cancer a few months ago in 2017, and he had a lifelong habit of heavy smoking. And of course, we were convinced that his heavy smoking caused the cancer. He argued a bit because it wasn't lung cancer that he had, but it was stomach cancer, which then spread to something else. In the end, who knew what it turned into? So, the smoking definitely contributed to his cancer. And I watched this man go from a hefty, burly, big man to down to nothing. He got to the point where he was wearing clothes smaller than what I wear, and I'm considered a petite woman. I told him at one point that he looked like Gandhi. So I am definitely in favor of very strict measures on smoking. I've always been staunchly against it. It's a terrible, disgusting habit that greatly harms the person, not just the person smoking, of course, but the people who have to Breathe it in, the people who are victimized and subject to it. And even though maybe only 14% of the population smokes, that's still too many when you consider in certain metropolitan areas where I live, like New York and New Jersey, you can't even be outside standing at the bus stop without being bombarded with people's cigarette smoke. It's like no escape, even though you're outside, and they figure, well, they're outside, so the wind is blowing it. Yeah, the wind is blowing it right up my nose. And it's a definite violation of my personhood, and I shouldn't have to suffer from someone else's sickness. So I am particularly pleased that even smokers themselves want tougher regulations. And I was a bit surprised that it said that the article said that even smokers don't want to smoke. And I'm happy that that is the case, because why in the world would you want to poison your body, yourself? Why would you want to annoy and repulse the people around you? Because honestly, when a smoker comes around me, I move away. And I'm thinking to myself, they're trying to push me away, because that's exactly what they're doing, because it is impossible for me to stand there and take it. So, tougher measures on smoking, the price of cigarettes going up. Do not expect pity from me. I'm sorry if I don't understand this addiction. I'm so grateful that I don't suffer from it, that I didn't have friends who did that. My dad smoked when we were very little. I would say I was probably about 10 when he stopped, and it was mainly because my mom just prohibited it in the house. She was strongly against it. And then he had a hernia, and that's when he really stopped, when the nurse told him to stop. And he said the way she said it, like, you know, he wasn't going to live long unless he stopped smoking. He just quit. He didn't have to do any patches or chew gum. He didn't do it in stages. It was just a huge wake-up call for him, and he stopped and never returned. And as someone who watched a loved one wither away down to nothing right next to me in the bed, I know firsthand the damage smoking can do to a person. And just thinking about it, I mean, this was my man. We lived together. He was right next to me in the bed every night. I could not imagine him just disappearing. And even now, I still find it hard to believe that he's gone. And over something so stupid. And even when he was on the chemo, he kept on smoking. You know, he said if he was going to die, he was going to die happy. So the smoking definitely played a role. And I just don't want to see anybody go through this kind of pain. I feel like he died too soon. He was taken from me too soon. You know, he came to me and the later stages of his life. He was already 54 by the time I met him. So, of course, I didn't know he was on his way out. I didn't know I was only going to have a few years with him. And I do feel like it's not fair. It's not fair that the man was just snatched away from me when things were just getting started. We knew each other for about 6 years, by the way, in case you're wondering. Well, how soon was it? So, and we lived together for a few years. So I did have some quality time with the man, but I was hoping for a lot more years with him. And that's my take. Thank you for listening, and I hope you subscribe to my channel. I will come to you every week with pertinent articles that I feel I can discuss with intelligence and interest. Have a great day.